Welcome to our most recent episode in the podcast cooperation between the Roberts Center at Norfolk State University, Virginia Beach Cultural Affairs Office, and the Virginia Beach History Museums. We are here today with some wonderful guests to talk about voting rights in the 20th century in our final episode for the 100th year of the commemoration of Black history in America. Get to the right screen. Our sponsor today and of all of our podcasts is WNSB Hot 91, the soul of Virginia. And our wonderful collaborator on this podcast is Mr. Maynard Scales, our station manager. Maynard, do you have anything you want to add? All right. Also sponsoring us today and here with us in the studio today is Hillary Plate, the Programming Manager and Partnerships Manager of Cultural Affairs for the City of Virginia Beach. Welcome, Hillary.
Thank you. It's really such a pleasure to be part of this podcast program, and especially this series that's presented by Norfolk State University's Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for the African Diaspora Studies. WNSB, thank you, and the City of Virginia Beach Cultural Affairs Department and Virginia Beach History Museums, along with the Princess Anne County Training School Union Kempsville High School alumni and Friends Association. Very excited for this episode, the final episode of the 25-26 season of Black History, Black Futures. And this important discussion is part of several that took place all year long from February to February, discussing labor challenges faced by African Americans here in Hampton Roads and beyond. And then this finale episode dedicated to the 2026 theme, 100 Years of Celebrating African American History Month. I'm very excited that you're going to be diving deep into the history of voting rights, exploring the lessons and critical takeaways that we can all use to safeguard equal rights in the 21st century. And to the folks listening and watching, if you like this episode, please let us know, subscribe, share, and visit the show notes. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us for today's event. Since this is pre-recorded, this is our message for our in-studio and Zoom members that joining today's event implies your consent to participate in this recording. All right, so our program, as we've said, is part of a series presented by our four partners. And moderating today is me. I'm Dr. Stephanie Richmond, Professor of History and the Director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for the African Diaspora Studies at Norfolk State University. I'm also the Project Director of Soul Downriver, a digital history project funded by the Mellon Foundation and Virginia African American Cultural Center, tracing the lives of 20+ thousand Virginians sold into the domestic slave trade. All right. So our podcast today, our episode today is particularly important in Virginia as we are rapidly approaching a special election on April 21st about redistricting. And so we wanted to share an important message about why it is important that everyone who is able to vote, your vote is your voice. You deserve to be heard. Your opinions deserve to be heard. People died for you to have the right to vote, no matter who you are in this country. And voting is really the only way in our current political system for you to make a real difference on a local, state, and national level. And elections, even local elections, have consequences locally, statewide, and nationally. So please go out and vote in the special election on the 21st and in our regularly scheduled elections every May and November. All right, our panelists this go round are Dr. Charles Ford, my esteemed colleague here at Norfolk State University and professor of history. He has been the director of the Quality Enhancement Plan at NSU and chair of the history department. He was chair when I was hired. So in the 1990s, he began his primary research in 18th century Britain and the Atlantic world and published the book Hannah More, A Critical Biography in 1996. But more recently, Dr. Ford has pursued and published a number of projects explicitly dealing with the desegregation of public schools in Norfolk, Virginia. And he and Dr. Jeff Littlejohn have published a number of books, including Elusive Equality, Queer Virginia, and The Enemy Within Never Did Without. When he is not prolifically researching and writing, Dr. Ford has a long history of civic engagement in Hampton Roads. He's been president of the Norfolk Chamber Consorts Board of Trustees, the chair of the Hampton Roads Pride's History and Scholarship Committees, and a member of Hampton Roads Pride's Board of Trustees, and a member of the Norfolk Public Library Board of Trustees. Given his multiple roles as historian, teacher, and administrator, Dr. Ford is keenly interested in recruiting history majors and making history curricula more effective in Virginia. Dr. Jeffrey Littlejohn is professor of history at Sam Houston State University and a former faculty member here at Norfolk State. A native of Dallas, Texas, he completed his undergraduate degree at Belmont University in Nashville and his MA and PhD at the University of Arkansas. He is author and co-editor of 5 books and more than a dozen articles with Dr. Charles Ford, including Race and Recreation in East Texas, the Cabinus family lynching, which was the winner of the 2019 H. Bailey Carroll Award and the 2018 Special Award for Research and Writing on Texas in World War I from the Texas State Historical Society. Dr. Littlejohn also works as a digital and public historian on projects such as Lynching in Texas, East Texas History, Historical MX, the Underground Railroad in Virginia, the Brown Decision, and Democracy and Diversity in Walker County, Texas. Welcome, Dr. Littlejohn.
Thank you.
And last but not least, our third panelist today is Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander, who should need no introduction on this podcast, but she is the endowed professor of Virginia Black History and Culture and the former dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Norfolk State University. She is the author of numerous books and articles, including Daily Life on the Underground Railroad, Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad, and has received grants totaling over $1.5 million and has served on numerous boards and commissions, including as co-chair of the Virginia Commission on African American History Education in the Commonwealth, the Virginia Commission to Study Slavery, Norfolk Fest Events, Portsmouth VA 250 Committee, Norfolk VA 250 Committee, and the Commission to Study the Uprooting of Black Communities by Public Institutions of Higher Education in the Commonwealth. Dr. Newby Alexander has been on numerous national programs and documentaries, and both in the United States and on the BBC, and on many podcasts. Welcome, Dr. Newby.
Thank you.
All right, so I want to jump right in and ask our 3 panelists, what is the background for voting rights for African Americans in Virginia? Dr. Ford?
Well, voting rights has been very contested, and for African Americans, especially after Reconstruction, African Americans could vote in Virginia, unlike other southern states, but the poll taxes made it very, very difficult, and also other ways of preventing people from voting, from suppressing voting, including the blank form to fill out, depending on what the registrar wanted. Of course, they'd say, "Oh, you missed this vital piece of information. We can't have you. You'll have to come back later." And of course, they would have varying, shifting hours, office hours for the registrar. You never know when they'll be open or not. All kinds of scams.
Okay, I'll just jump on in. So here in Virginia, many African Americans were required. If you were free black, you were actually required to pay double taxes. Mm-hmm. You had to pay because you were free black, and you had to pay your real estate and personal property taxes. And this went on through the entire antebellum period, which is essentially from 1800 to 1860. Mm-hmm. So you had to pay taxes with no ability to be represented. And so what Virginia did was the thing that they argued during the American Revolution, no taxation without representation. They implemented that for African Americans, free and enslaved. But as soon as the Civil War ended, African American men advocated for their rights and privileges and were part of the Union government in some way. You had, for example, Wilson, Joseph T. Wilson, who served as the head of the measurements for the port. And that was really important. That was a powerful position. And he eventually rose to the rank of colonel in the Grand Army of the Republic, very well positioned, well revered, and was one of the first to actually cast his ballot in 1867 to elect people to represent those in the Commonwealth to rewrite the Constitution of Virginia. And in that rewriting, it empowered black men to be able to vote. And so you had this slow movement, but it was pushed by African Americans who were in the legislature. And we would see representatives from Princess Anne County, from Norfolk County, from Portsmouth, Norfolk, and Richmond, as well as a few other places in the state, Williamsburg, York County, James City County, who were representing African Americans. Of course, at that time, only men could vote, but African American men were rising to that task. But then, of course, we saw the readjuster period at the end betray black male voters, and they eventually removed their rights through a series of legislation, finally culminating in the 1902 new Constitution that stripped African American men, for the most part, from voting. Then you would see that slow slog efforts by black lawyers, advocacy groups, eventually by large organizations to push for the restoration of the right to vote. And so what happened in Virginia was symptomatic of what happened in a lot of states throughout the nation, whether they were north, south, east, or west. And eventually everything culminating in the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which we thought was the standard, but the Supreme Court told us it wasn't, and they started whittling away and finally destroying that particular act.
Dr. Littlejohn, do you have anything more to add?
I would just say more generally that we live in a Republican form of government, and that voting is an essential characteristic of our, representative republic. We believe that voting is the way we determine who represents us in government and makes decisions for us. We don't participate in a direct democracy. We elect people through our vote to represent us and make laws that are representative of what we want. And those rights were systematically taken away from in the American South in 1864 million enslaved African Americans who made up 1/3 of the entire population of the South. And it took a civil war and the death of 800,000 people during that war to win the citizenship rights for African Americans. They participated in that war. They fought for their freedom. And as a result of the war, we saw the passage and ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But that 14th Amendment was critical because it overturned, and this has been in the news so much lately about birthright citizenship. In 1857, the Supreme Court had said in the Dred Scott case that no black person, enslaved or free, could be a citizen of the United States. And that technically would reduce or eliminate the right to vote if you're not a citizen. And so that 14th Amendment and the idea of birthright citizenship, that all people born or naturalized in the United States are citizens and therefore have rights as citizens, And then, of course, the 15th Amendment saying that the right to vote could not be abridged because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude was an attempt by Republicans to enfranchise Black men across the country, and especially in the South, so that they could participate in their own governance. And as Dr. Newby Alexander said, they held office after the Civil War in every one of the former Confederate states, both locally and statewide, and rewrote constitutions that enfranchised and represented their interest. And then, of course, we can talk about later how those rights were impeded and taken away over the course of the late 19th and 20th century.
Thank you.
And Stephanie, could I add something? So my colleagues are exactly right. Even in the antebellum period, there were women who were advocating for their right to vote as well. And you had one Black woman in particular who joined with, this group of suffrage supporters, like Lucretia Mott, for example, or Susan B. Anthony. And that was Sojourner Truth, who was advocating. There are a lot of people today who say, oh, well, that was back then. They didn't think that way, and so supposedly they could be excused for their racism or for their misogyny. But the reality is that Sojourner Truth advocated for the rights of all people to vote. And she was one of the first to say everyone should be able, if they're a citizen of this country, and all of us who've been born in this country should be citizens, we all should have the right to vote. And I would say what is interesting about this particular topic are the ones who were deprived the most, and even today there's this ongoing effort to deprive them, have been at the forefront of advocating the inclusion of everyone, men and women, those who are trans, those who are LBGTQ. They're including everyone, and they said we're all citizens and we all have the right to vote.
Yeah. Yeah, it's Frederick Douglass who, the masthead of his newspaper is right is of no sex and truth is of no color,
Yes.
right? Who was the one who insisted that the Declaration of Women in 1848 included, Seneca
Yes.
Falls Declaration included the call for the right to vote, and then Truth's collaborator on the speaking circuit, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper,
Yes.
wrote very powerfully, we are all bound up in one great mess of humanity, to talk about intersectionalism and the right to vote. All right, so we have Sojourner Truth and one of the few photographs depicting her injured hand that it still exists. All right, so Dr. Newby Alexander, you want to talk a little bit more about suffrage movements in Norfolk at the very end of the Civil War?
Sure, and my colleagues can join in with me. I mean, this equal suffrage address got national attention, and a lot of people don't realize how important this was, that the Blacks in Norfolk met and began to talk about and lay out their argument as to why they should be equal, why there should be equality in the suffrage movement, and how they will proceed to push that particular agenda forward nationally. And because they spoke on multiple levels as to why people deserve to have suffrage, it was the model that was adopted by a number of agencies to seek equality across the board.
It also led to racial violence here.
Oh, absolutely.
And a real backlash. And any accomplishments or advocacy always has this terrible suppression coming back at it.
Usually that suppression whether it's openly or secretively sponsored by the government.
The government, yeah.
And that particularly was, in fact, this would eventually lead to a big riot here in Norfolk, in Memphis, in Richmond, and other cities where they were also marching and advocating for equal rights and voting rights and so forth. And it was so bad throughout the South that the Senate, the U.S. Senate, initiated an investigatory committee to see if there was a conspiracy involved, because it all happened on the same day when people were marching in support of the 1866 Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, not amendment, but the Equal Rights Act.
Jeff, do you have?
One of my favorite quotes from this is, and this is in the article Charles and I wrote on Evelyn Butts and Joseph Jordan, but one of my favorite quotes from the Equal Suffrage Address is they promised continuous political and economic pressure, but declared further in a defiant statement, traitors shall not dictate or prescribe to us the terms or conditions of our citizenship. And, I think that puts it in context. After the Civil War, the people in power in Virginia, many of them were former Confederates, and they were, from our view, traitors to the nation. They had seceded and founded their own country, and the black men of Norfolk said, "We will not be dictated to by traitors and cheaters. We will define our own citizenship."
A very powerful statement, especially in 1866, but today still as well. All right. So the black community in Norfolk in 1865 and 66 was making these strong statements. And how were those statements supported or blocked by the Reconstruction Act of 1867 and the 14th and 15th Amendments? Dr. Littlejohn, you want to start us off?
Well, I mean, the Reconstruction Act of 1867 divided the South into 5 military districts and left Union troops in those districts to support the rights of African Americans who the federal government knew were going to be targeted by, former Confederates. And so that was a crucial aspect of Reconstruction, was the maintenance of Union or Northern troops in the South through that period. And it made possible the drafting of a new constitution and at the state level, and then also the passage and ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which we kind of mentioned earlier. But the 14th Amendment set up birthright citizenship for all people born in the U.S. It provided that no state could deny any person life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That was meant to counter the black codes that had been passed in so many of the former Confederate states. And then it also had that crucial aspect, that crucial clause that we talk about in so much of civil rights history, the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, that the states are required to provide the equal protection of the laws to all people. And in that case, it's not even citizens. All people are to be afforded equal protection of the laws. Of course, that's an ideal. It is federal law. It is a constitutional provision. But as we all know, that oftentimes was not the case. But it was the Equal Protection Clause became the principal tool of civil rights attorneys to overturn discriminatory practices that were passed at the state level and state after state. And then, of course, the 15th Amendment, as we said, was about the right to vote should not be abridged or shall not be abridged because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And, of course, the intent, which was different than the practice, but the intent was to enfranchise black men in the former Confederate states so that they could participate in their own government.
And I like what you said, Jeff. As you talked about the Equal Protection Clause, not the way that the Supreme Court in the 1880s interpreted it, but the reason for that Equal Protection Clause was to say, hey, when it comes to your rights as citizens, the federal government will ensure, because these are across all these different states. So interstate commerce is a way that the federal government can come in and monitor that and dictate that. By the 1880s, the Supreme Court did its backflipping of crazy rationale as to how that should be interpreted, and then it was refashioned much later. The one thing I like about the picture that we have up here is that when the 15th Amendment enfranchised people, especially black men, that picture shows every classification, every condition. So you have one man who looks like he had been enslaved. You have another man who's wearing his uniform, so clearly he served during the Civil War. Another man who looks like a businessman, so he may have been a free black, and he continued, of course, to operate his business. And so, this is suggesting that it's not based on your class. It is, however, based on gender, and the 15th Amendment resulted in a break in the women's suffrage movement because so many white women were furious that black men got the right to vote before they got the right. They thought everything was going to happen at once, or that they would be enfranchised first. But that 15th Amendment became a real sticking point.
But the intentional forgetting of the 14th Amendment really persisted well into the 1960s. And it was Joe Jordan and Evelyn Butts, who we'll talk about a little later, here in Norfolk, who used that argument as not their first argument, right? Because of the previous interpretations that ignored that obvious wording. And it was obviously intentional. Here are state and local poll taxes, equal protection of the law by states. You'd think no-brainer. Again, that was not their first argument.
Definitely.
All right, thank you. All right, so fast forwarding about 40 years to 1902, when Virginia held a new constitutional convention and passed a new state constitution without a public referendum. This allowed the Democrats to secure control in Virginia that lasted until 1971 and institute white supremacist-backed laws. This included restrictive voting measures like a poll tax, literacy tests, and quote-unquote understanding clauses that allowed the people in power to disenfranchise African-American men and poor white men, thereby reducing the black electorate by 90% from where it had been since the 1870s.
And I'm going to just jump in really quick and say that this constitutional convention happened because throughout the 1880s and 1890s, Virginia was, because of the readjusters who betrayed the blacks who supported them in the office, and most of the readjusters were former Confederates who seemed like they were sympathetic to blacks. But as soon as they got into power, they enacted laws that began to repress them. So one of the first laws was if you owed any back taxes, if you had any debts, you could not vote. And they were selective in who they, chose to not vote. And so they began to whittle down the black electorate throughout the 1880s, so much so that there were almost no representatives in the General Assembly by 1890.
Yeah, and the 1902 Constitution replaced the 1868 Constitution, which allowed much more freedoms for African Americans. And also, 1902 Constitution talked about efficient schools which essentially legalized and rationalized the Jim Crow system, brought in all of the public accommodations, everything. Everything was efficient. It was a dual system. And to me, that's just the opposite of what efficient is from a business standpoint.
Redundant.
It's redundant, exactly.
Yeah. I'd like to, Stephanie, if I may, read a quote just to drive home that this Constitution was designed intentionally to discriminate. And we know that, but hearing the words from somebody at the time who was key in the passage of this Constitution, Carter Glass, who was a representative there, he said to the convention, discrimination, why, that is precisely what we propose. That is why this convention was elected, to discriminate to the very extremity of permissible action with a view to the elimination of every Negro voter who can be gotten rid of legally without impairing the numerical strength of the white electorate. So, I mean, there was no secret about what was going on here. That's what strikes me so much about so much of our nation's history, is that when you dig into it, so many times when we talk about the past, we talk about it in passive voice, that these things just happen. Well, they didn't just happen. There were individual actors who intended to discriminate and eliminate Black voters and created laws and passed and ratified constitutions. The purpose was to get rid of a certain class or group of voters. And of course, Carter Glass would later, I mean, he was at the Constitutional Convention, but he would later be in the United States Congress. He was a senator, and he also is the person who we know the Owen Glass Federal Reserve Act of 1913 passed and created under Woodrow Wilson, who was also a Virginian and was also a infamous discriminatory politician. I mean, this was a nexus of powerful white men who wanted to control everything and who wanted to eliminate Black voters who would challenge their authority. So it's just these things didn't happen just in passive voice. There are bad actors carrying these acts out.
And they're not extremists, not considered extremists at the time. Carter Glass would go on to help FDR with the Glass-Steagall Act during the New Deal. So these are mainstream politicians pushing suppression, voter suppression, and doing so openly and explicitly.
Yes.
And it reminds us of what George Santayana, the great sociologist, said about those who do not understand or know their history.
Yeah.
And of course, part of what we would see by the early 20th century is an effort, a consistent, persistent effort in the school systems to promote a certain type of narrative that excluded everything that would make people feel bad about not adhering to the idealism of America, freedom and equality for everyone, liberty for everybody. So then you have to exclude the stories, most of the stories of our past, and you have to create these false narratives as well as these mythologies, so then you get these iconic figures of the founding fathers and erase the fact that they were slaveholders, erase the fact that many of them did not support the rights of all people, especially of people who were considered minorities in this country, considered the other gender. We're going to stand and while we're promoting these other ideals. And so I think it's ironic that we're still in that state.
I don't know if it's ironic or that's the reason we are still in that
True,
state, right?
True.
Uh,
Well, I'm thinking about the 100 years since that point, and how we have seemingly progressed, but then not really progressed, and it's because we've had a silent group of people in America who still adhered to those ideas in terms of how they thought about it, what they taught their children, the environment in which they were raised, and now they have an opportunity to reinstitute that so they feel comfortable about their attitudes.
Okay. Well, so these constitutional conventions, we also just wanted to share an image of the 1867-68 Constitutional Convention, which is quite different than the, I think, all-white 1902 convention, right, where we can see a number of African-American men in the chamber who were actively taking part in drafting Virginia's new constitution after the Civil War.
If we could pause just for a minute, the reason I think this image is so important because it should be a reminder after the 1902 Constitutional Convention. Let's go back to 1868. That Constitutional Convention was representative. It was demographically, except for women, it was demographically representative of our Commonwealth at that particular time. And when I say demographically, you had both free and formerly enslaved people in there. You had some whites who came out of poverty, and they were now representing their areas. This was a very, very different environment for the first time in Virginia's history. But I find it interesting that the illustrator who did this drawing that was published in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper selected one person to be the focal point of this scene, and that person stands in the middle, and unlike all the others, he's not only standing up but completely facing the artist. That person was from Princess Anne County, which is now Virginia Beach. And that is Willis A. Hodges, who was a free black, who was both an abolitionist. He worked on the Underground Railroad. He was a businessman. He was a journalist. And then he became very active in Reconstruction politics. And he served actually in the legislature until about 1890. And so he was an incredible and powerful force in the legislature that we really need to, even though there's been work done on his life, and he actually wrote an autobiography, but there's a lot more that needs to be done about looking into his life as well as the lives of so many of these other representatives at this particular time.
Thank you. All right. So all three of you contributed articles to the book Black Citizens and American Democracy that was published at a time when the nation was turning against diversity, equity, and inclusion. Can you each tell us a little bit about the focus of your article and what do you want readers of this book to take away from your work? Dr. Ford?
Well, from the work on Joseph Jordan and Evelyn Butts, it really takes a partnership or collaboration and networks to get rid of major suppression and initiatives that are there to oppress. I mean, you can't do it yourself. You have to team up with others. And Evelyn Butts was an unlikely person to do it because she was a seamstress. She was a working class person, everyday person. But she was determined to get rid of these poll taxes because she wanted to be voting a full citizenship. And Joseph Jordan, I mean, he had been injured in France right after World War II. He had to overcome being disabled as well as being African American to again achieve a law degree and become a great advocate for civil rights. And so the two of them together, the learned attorney and, of course, the populist person in the neighborhoods with the connections there, the grassroots, seem to get things done much more quickly than you would expect.
Dr. Newby?
So my article looked at Black women and their advocacy. Often the involvement of Black women's organizations, especially the National Council of Negro Women, has been overlooked. This was an organization founded by Mary McLeod Bethune in 1935. And the purpose of the organization was to pull together all of the voices of the many, many Black female organizations throughout the country into a single voice that would have political power and punch. And so to garner what would become 500,000 voices in this country, if you can imagine, 1930, beginning in 1935, to eventually galvanize that many voices together, and you bring that amount of women's brain power together. They were the ones who helped to really lay out the plans for how can we get this job done? How can we end this discriminatory behavior? How can we transform our societies? How can we galvanize each and every community to do essentially the same thing or have the same goal in those communities? And many of these women were professionals. They were social workers. They were politicians. They were, and by politicians, group or community advocates and organizers. They were teachers. They were librarians. They were professors. I mean, they galvanized these powerful voices together, and they began to punch at the way in which democracy was carried out for African Americans, which was really anti-democratic. And they were the ones who actually laid the plan for how to end school segregation. They were the ones who laid out the plan for how can we get these cities to begin to provide resources to the Black community in the same way that they were providing resources to the white communities. Because in the South, there were no Black orphanages. There were no Black hospitals. And so you did have medical doctors, independently creating this. But what about a network where you can plug in and provide these resources to communities? And so that was what my article focused on.
Thank you. And Dr. Littlejohn, I'm going to tweak this question a little bit, and since you were one of the editors of the collection, and ask what do you want readers to take away from the whole collection, in addition to what your article, your contributions were?
Well, this book came out of an earlier connection between two of my colleagues, Reginald Ellis and Peter Levy, who we had attended a 2013 NEH program at Harvard University with Patricia Sullivan and Waldo Martin. And we had done a book a few years ago, and we decided with the election, this book was really, kind of intended to come out on the eve of the 2024 election, although we didn't quite make it by that date. But the book is about Black activism and the way it has saved democracy. That was our initial argument, was that it was Black Americans who consistently fought against discrimination and racism and legal structures that were meant to create essentially an oligarchy with wealthy white people running the nation. And that consistently it was Black activism at the local level, Black women like Evelyn Butts, lawyers like Joseph Jordan, who challenged those norms and fought for equality at the local level. I think also it's about all history is local in a sense. I mean, it takes real people acting locally, risking. I mean, think of what Joseph Jordan and Evelyn Butts risked to make their campaign to end the poll tax in Virginia. I mean, certainly they were targeted for criticism. They could, unless they had their own jobs independently, which Joseph Jordan did as an attorney, but they were targeted by the state. I mean, Joseph Jordan and his law partners, Edward Dolly and Leonard Holt, had their law practice destroyed by the state of Virginia. And his two partners had left the state because of what the state had done to them and moved to California. So the risks were enormous. And nevertheless, they persevered, challenged, and ultimately made changes, not just for the Black community, but for the entire breadth of American society.
Thank you. All right. So, in kind of interest of time, we have two questions remaining that I would like to ask you, and then a bunch of images that we wanted to share. And so, I want to start with the question. I think I'm going to flip the order of these two, about what impact does the effort to erase stories of Black history have on staving off the negative economic impact that the current administration's policy is having on Black workers and the employment landscape, particularly here in Hampton Roads and Virginia, but also across the nation?
I think it's galvanizing a lot of people to resist.
Oh, yeah.
If you try to erase people's history, and you do it in very public ways, you do it by erasing it from the national parks. You do it by attacking the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C. You do it in every level, at every level. You try to change narratives through news stations and through broadcasting industries, and I think people are getting more and more angry.
Well, the most egregious is the military erasure. Not only the blocking promotions based on gender and sex, obviously,
or race,
and erase the history of gender and racial integration, which was a great, wonderful story in the military, U.S. military. And of course, that's very pertinent for here at Hampton Roads, I think.
Absolutely. And of course, we've had a number of both African American men and women, as well as white women, who have taken on leadership roles in the military, top leadership roles, and they are being directly attacked, not because of their competence, but because of who they are, and more importantly, who they're not.
Because of their competence, I think they are successful.
Yes.
Therefore, we have to get rid of them.
Yes, yes. And so, that issue of erasure, if you've had 60, 70 years of trying not to erase, of pushing, then you can't suddenly try to erase and not get increasingly angry voices galvanized to fight against that.
Well, and I mean, I think here in Texas, things are a little bit worse than they are in Virginia. In terms of, I would say there are efforts, obviously, of erasure, but there are also efforts at obfuscation, making public memorials that are, I mean, for example, if you go to the Alamo and you try to follow the history that's presented there, it is so difficult to truly understand what has happened there. And I think it's intentional that the placards that tell the story of the Alamo try to create a symbol of Texas liberty and Texas greatness and Texas sacrifice, when in reality, I mean, the story of the Texas Revolution, as many scholars here have shown, is it's a story of enslavement. It's a story of mass migration of enslaved people from, like your project, Stephanie, is showing, from Virginia and the Upper South to, Mississippi and Texas. And going down, literally going down the river, and the mass, the largest forced migration in U.S. history, that forced migration of enslaved people from the Upper South to the Lower South. And there is just not a documentation of that record that Americans are familiar with. And I think that's intentional. I don't think that's just happened by happenstance.
Well, the fact that Texas was a tax haven for Louisiana, Mississippi planters, right, who couldn't pay their property taxes or couldn't pay the loans that they had taken out to purchase all of those enslaved people. And so they fled the country, right, to go to what was then Mexico, right, and then the Lone Star Republic, to escape paying their own taxes, and then started a whole war to keep enslaved people enslaved.
Exactly. So it's not it's not that heroic story that I was taught in the 70s in Texas public schools. It's a very different story that's emerging, and thank goodness it is. And I think there are efforts to obfuscate and silence those kinds of stories. So same thing is happening here that's happening in Virginia and across the country. And we just have to be vigilant and keep speaking out and keep telling our stories and keep documenting these stories for the public.
So I just wanted to recognize what Dr. Newby Alexander just said about, you think that, because your question was about the impact, and I normally don't jump in so much, but this really, that hit me because of the recent, the impact of erasure creating resistance on the local level. And we see the impact of the local level of people paying attention and taking action in Philadelphia with the National Monument, the removal of the panels, and then the replacement of the panels, the removal not standing. And I just wanted to acknowledge that because I think that's right there in recent moments, evidence of what you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, Stephanie, if you would go back one to the slide on the map with the map, one of the, I think the most interesting reversal, and it actually came right before this more recent transformation of our society. So this is right here on the eve of the election. So look at the increase in the numbers of people who voted, say, in Virginia versus in Texas. Now I'm seeing a lot of trend changes saying that there are a lot more dark areas on the map of a lot more people participating in the electoral process. And in point of fact, what we really want to see is at least 70% of the population at any point in time participating in the electoral process. If they don't, we don't really have a democracy. We have either the beginnings of an oligarchy or we already have an oligarchy. But I think the shifts will be interesting once we get to this next election to see what that map looks like.
And I was going to add, in addition to even what happened in Philadelphia, in the national parks across the country, right, people have been pouring out online to share the photographs that they took on their family vacations of signage that has been removed so that advocacy groups working with the National Park Service can maintain online digital records of what these places looked like before they were forced to comply with the federal order. And that's really important because it's citizen archiving and citizen journalism in a way that we needs to happen, right? And we've seen the similar things happening with people filming ICE stops and others, where people can take their presence and turn it into activism. So I wanted to kind of put together the question about what should people be learning about, and are we seeing a push back against some of the more not really more recent, but since 1900 kind of trend of rolling back civil rights activisms, and then since the 80s, right, with the chipping away of the 1964 and 65 Civil Rights Acts, to talk about the SAVE Act, right, which is currently on the table, right, and the efforts to amend the 1993 Voter Registration Act, and what this might do to the African American community, to the elderly, and to married women.
Who changed their names.
Especially, yes, those who changed their names. Well, and I should say, and men who have changed their names, because married women are not the only ones who do that. But so anyone who has had changed their name.
But it goes way beyond just voter ID, which most Republicans say, "Oh, let's just show your ID and you'll be fine." This is much more sinister in terms of requiring all kinds of other things that are just designed to oppress. So they're not designed to prevent non-citizens from voting, because non-citizens can't vote, and they haven't voted ever. So
yes, and there's a mythology that has been hammered into people's minds, and that mythology is that there are all these illegal people,
right,
all
or
of
dead
this
people.
illegal all this illegal voting, which does not happen. Has been proven that it does not happen, and yet there's this illusion that then is supposed to justify this action. And I have to say, this is like the post-Reconstruction era. There were all these arguments. If you have to create an argument like this to justify actions being taken that is in direct violation of the Constitution, you're in the wrong. And so we see this trend happening once again in the in now our post-Reconstruction era once again, that people are trying to put an onerous on those who should have free opportunity to vote, and trying to stop that. And also, I find it interesting that the points of attack are the same traditional points of attack. Let's attack black people in general, and let's attack women in particular. And now those were the same groups who were attacked in the post-Reconstruction period. And so the SAVES Act is not to save anybody. It is actually to save a white male oligarchy and trying to restore their exclusive power.
And even just the idea of a driver's license is a poll tax.
Yes.
Because this is a right for everyone, whether you drive or not.
Yes.
Whether you can afford a car or not. And as opposed to buying cigarettes or alcohol, where you do show your ID to show your age, because it's a privilege.
And let's just say that having a driver's license is not free.
Right, exactly.
You have to pay
you have to
for
pay.
it.
And a passport, too.
Yep,
So.
and passport, and important to point out, even if you have a real ID, right, that alone is not a valid documentation that you are a U.S. citizen. For the purposes of the SAVE Act, you have to produce a birth certificate or a passport that match, yes. And for many adults, right, I might still have my birth certificate, but also all of us in this room are old enough that our birth certificates probably do not meet identification requirements, because they are old, printed on a typewriter on tissue paper, and we may not have original signatures any longer.
Well, you're just stepping on my toes, Stephanie. I'm
sorry.
I know in Pennsylvania I had to pay.
Yeah, if you need a new copy of it, you have to pay.
So.
I mean, for most of us, we have to pay because some poor clerk needs to go dig in a lot of file cabinets to
Right,
find
yeah.
it.
And we won't even talk about the number of birth certificates that were wrong.
Mm-hmm.
When my mom was born in 1930, they listed her as a boy because whoever filled it out didn't
Checked the
fill
wrong
it out.
box.
That's
Yeah,
not
they
right,
did.
yeah, whatever, yeah.
Well, they're full of human errors. Not to mention if you were born at home,
Yes.
which
Yes,
was
and she was,
which
and
was
everybody was at
yes,
that time.
I was going to say which was very very common before the 1950s in the United States. You may not have a birth certificate, or it may have been filed weeks or months after you were
Yes.
born, and it may be wrong because it was probably filed at a pediatrician's appointment.
Yeah.
If you manage to go to the doctor. Right, and many of those records are missing, right? And we know government offices do the best they can, but stuff happens to files.
Well, and you've had fires in a
Fires,
lot
yes.
of offices
Yeah.
That have destroyed records.
So with all of our doom and gloom, is there any hope? That's my last question for you all. Is there any hope that we might be turning back in a more positive direction for voting rights, particularly for African Americans, but for everyone in our country?
Well, the latest elections, the most recent state and local or by-elections, show more enthusiasm for voting. There's less apathy. People are seeing the results, the effects. The erasure is very real, the discrimination very explicit, very pointed, and therefore I think people are much more willing to vote and see it as important to vote for people that want to protect the right to vote and not just to oppress the rights of others, mythical others that might be out there to counteract their vote, right?
Well, and we just saw with the No Kings rally, this latest edition, that was the largest public demonstration in U.S. history. And I think, the SAVE Act is an example of the fear that exists at the top, because we can't win by normal democratic procedures. We're going to redistrict the states. We're going to gerrymander the states and try to eke out as many representatives as we can from hardcore conservative places like Texas. We're going to demonize Hispanic and Latino people and suggest that they vote illegally. They're not citizens. And the SAVE Act is Save America from the outsider. That's such a Confederate idea. That's such a Southern idea, that it's outside agitators who are endangering.
Well, it's even worse than that. It's the enemy within, which is coming out of fascist Italy and Germany.
Yeah, and we have to save things from the outsider. And in fact, it's just the opposite. It's an attempt to demonize people and to create racial conflict and to disenfranchise probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people.
It reminds me also of what that film Birth of a Nation did, and the books that were written in support of that, and that is, that it's the Ku Klux Klan now who are the saviors of America. This horrifically racist, misogynistic, violent organization is somehow going to save America, and it's that same historical trope that we have seen for 150, 200 plus years in American society reemerging again. But on the plus side, these kinds of rallies like the No Kings rally, that was attended in a bipartisan way. It was not just one political group joining in. It's because people in America are not recognizing the country that they thought they lived in. And so I think if you push, America has always been, I always think about the Broadway play and musical 1776, where there was this song that says essentially that, America has always sort of been in the middle, maybe leaning a little bit to the right, but never to the extremes. And so I think when we see this huge push to an extreme, it causes some kind of cultural reaction in America that says, wait a minute, we're not going in that direction. We need much more of a balance. And so I think we are beginning to see some correctives going on and taking place in the minds of many Americans.
All right. Well, thank you all. I just wanted to draw some attention to a selected bibliography, including works by our panelists, Black Citizens and American Democracy, right on top. Evelyn Butts' daughter, right, who wrote Fearless about her mother. Elusive Equality by Drs. Littlejohn and Dr. Ford, and Barbara Bransby's fantastic book on Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement. All definitely worth the read, and most of them likely available, especially if you're in Virginia, through your public library. So I encourage you to look at all of those. And I wanted to extend a deep thank you to our partners and our panelists today, and for all of our podcasts this year as this wraps up our 2025-26 podcast season. Thank you so much to Hillary Plate and her team over at Virginia Beach Cultural Affairs. We could not do this without their support and backing. And particular thanks to Dr. Newby Alexander, who is the intellectual driver of this podcast and has worked very hard to put together and bring together all of the wonderful panelists that we have spoken to over the past several years, and to Mr. Scales and the WNSB staff for doing all of the technical support. It has made my life personally much easier because I don't have to edit all of the podcasts anymore. So thank you all so much. And with that call, please go vote. Yes. Right? People fought and died for the right to do this. And we cannot move forward and past and upwards from our current situation. And lastly, I'd like to thank our panelists today, Dr. Jeffrey Littlejohn, Dr. Charles Ford, and Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander for their wonderful conversation about voting rights in Virginia and the nation.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Recording stopped.
Recording.
Thank you, Jeff. That was fabulous.
That was great.
Thank you for including me.
Actually, yeah. My first